Hello and welcome to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflicts webinar entitled What Uganda's Poor and Educated Classes and Activists Can Teach People Resisting Autocrats Across the World. And I think there's going to be a big need for that, not just in Africa and Uganda, but many other places around the world. So we're excited to welcome you and all the participants. We have a number of people on board that have signed up from around the world, and we'll look forward to engaging you as we move forward. This is the second in ICNC's Voices from the Field series. We have normally done academic and practitioner-focused webinars, and we're moving more and more to those webinars, advice, engagement with activists and practitioners that are actively engaged in training and involved in movements in the field. And so we're really excited today to hear from a group that's going to be talking about ongoing struggles in Uganda, including successes in organizing and training peasant farmers, small business people, agriculturalists, and informal transportation sector. These campaigns are actually led and waged by the most underprivileged groups in their society with counterparts from across the global south. These budding and sustained movements are evidence that marginalized, community-led movements add longevity and effectiveness to broader struggles for change. And I'm really excited to have with us here today, who will be leading the webinar, Phil Wilmot, who is husband to Susan Abang Wilmot. Together, they co-founded Solidarity Uganda with a group of Ugandan activists. The organization aims to train social and environmental advocacy groups throughout Uganda in the skills, methods, and concepts of nonviolence. Phil and Susan reside in Lira, Uganda, which is northern Uganda, with their daughter, Asing Nadia. They have been working with a number of campaigns and movements around the country, including informal transport workers, farmers, urban activists, as we've discussed, and they're teaching them nonviolent resistance action strategies and tactics to help to build people power to improve the lives in local communities in Uganda. Phil has trained hundreds of people in nonviolent strategy and movement building, especially in East Africa. He writes for Waging Nonviolence and Mobilization Lab, and he recently published a book on his 2014 detainment in a Ugandan jail cell. It's called A Wolf Dressed in Sheepskin, A White Guy's Dilemma in a Uganda Jail Cell. And it's actually amazing reading, so you all need to pick that up as well. He's an advisor for Beautiful Rising and is also one of the LIN, Local Learning Initiative, at ICNC, one of our 2016 fellows, along with Susan Abang Wilmot and Daniel Tulabagenyi, who's from Uganda and now with us in the United States. Another person that will be part of the webinar, and she'll be coming through us via video, is Scovia Era Nightway. She's a director and trainer of Solidarity Uganda and organizers with the Women's Movement and the Jobless Brotherhood. Scovia works with people of all social classes in Kampala, Uganda. She ran an activist-centered rapid response system for political prisoners, which also functioned to build bridges between movements. So with that introduction, we're really excited to welcome Phil and his deep expertise and understanding and ideas that he'll share with you today. Go ahead, Phil.
Thanks a lot, Catherine, for the introduction. I am humbled to be here and talk with many of you who are working all around the world for justice, for peace, for dignity. The political scene around the world is of course becoming more repressive. So these are the conversations that we need to have. We need to keep exchanging ideas amongst ourselves and ensure that that we're pulling best practices and getting creative ideas from one another. I think your introduction is more than sufficient. I'm just going to open my little presentation here. So maybe just one thing that you didn't mention much. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and because of my marriage, I ended up in East Africa here in northern Uganda. But the basic point of this this discussion that we'll have today is quite simple. My hypothesis is something which is quite simple, but it's all too often overlooked by movements. Here's the gist of it. So often, victims and people directly affected by a particular injustice are not the ones spearheading a campaign or a movement, but they should be. Not just because of some ethical value necessarily, but they're just better at doing it. They have a dog in the fight. They stand to win or lose something. Their lives will be affected for better or worse based on the success or lack thereof of their particular campaign or movement. And hence they're more determined and they're more focused on their goals. So people like me, people of privilege, I'm you know, a white American, Protestant, straight, firstborn male. I hold a U.S. passport. You know, I'm here in Uganda. We allies and people of privilege should perceive our roles as supporting roles, as people from the background, people that are standing in solidarity with victims that are spearheading their respective struggles. So I just want to give a little bit about, let me see how to change the slide here, about our personal story as Solidarity Uganda. We are an organization, a network of activists that train grassroots communities, we do train activists and organizers, but we also train many people that wouldn't necessarily use that language. We train farmers. Catherine gave a brief list of some of the kinds of groups that we work with, taxi drivers and union members and so on. Uganda, a little bit of the background on Uganda. It's been independent since 1962. It's a former British protectorate. But the political narrative has always been liberation through violent struggle, through bush wars, through coups. And people have always kind of inherited their political situation. There wasn't so much of a resistance against colonialism. There were gems of that, there were pieces of that in Uganda's history, but not to the same extent as, say, our neighbors to the west in Congo or to the east in Kenya, where every other person's grandmother, you know, fought in the Mau Mau. Here in Uganda, that history of resistance isn't as thorough. So we knew that as we were starting Solidarity Uganda, we were entering not necessarily new terrain, but a pretty fresh one. And we decided that if this whole concept, this idea that we had of training people for civil resistance, for nonviolent action, to build movements and resist land grabbers, resist dictators, resist militarization, if this thing could work, we had to try it in the most difficult place in the country that we could find. Because at the time, you know, we didn't have any connections, we weren't well connected, we didn't have much money. You know, we were just young activists that were committed to this idea of nonviolent civil resistance. And so we took a district called Amuru district. This is a district which is almost every person residing in the district gets their sustenance from agriculture, from the land. And this has been true since the 14th century when the Acholi people settled in this particular area of northern Uganda. Well, it happened to be a heavily militarized zone of Uganda because there were prospects of the land. The soil is very fertile, so a lot of foreign investors, a South African investor especially, but also an Indian sugarcane company, were very interested in acquiring the land that hundreds of thousands of people reside on. This is an area of land which is about 100,000 acres, and if you can later on Google the size of your county, for example, if you're in the United States, and you'll find that 100,000 acres of land maybe comes close to the size of your county. So a very massive piece of land is in contestation. And the residents were being forced off their land by the military. They were being forcefully displaced. Their homes were being burnt down. Their animals were being shot. Some people were being raped as intimidation tactic. It was a heavily militarized place. And we realized that if we could make any kind of success here when we were just young, disorganized, didn't have any money, then probably that would mean we could scale up this idea of training people in nonviolent action and make it effective in other parts of East Africa as well. for 2 years, we trained local people to train one another. There were about 3 of us who were trainers initially, and then as we trained some of the community organizers, they would call together meetings of sometimes more than 1,000 people to come and get like a day-long training, and people would sometimes skip lunch. We didn't have money, you know, so people would come from walk several kilometers and learn about nonviolent direct action. And after 2 years, we didn't know how much impact we were making, but it all kind of came to a head one day when some information leaked that the state had sent a caravan of government ministers to go and so that part of the land would restrict, and where they had political allies that could help them grab the land on behalf of a foreign investor. So the community became informed of this caravan. I started setting up roadblocks. I'll show another picture here. There were children from, a lot of children walk, you know, like 20 kilometers to the nearest primary school. It's a very underserved area of Uganda. So even the children and the parents came out to march and to sing songs, and there was a military occupation, an encampment in one village called Apa, and some of the organizers would go to the police and encourage them to defect and put down their guns and explain, you know, we're only going to use nonviolent tactics. There's no need for you to bring your guns and patrol us. There are hundreds of us, and a lot of the police, not all of them, but many of them, some of them ran away and then would cooperate with some of the organizers. And this is not something that's common in Uganda. We have a very militarized dictatorship here. So the tactic that people know about from this particular story came from a handful, maybe 5 or 6 old ladies. In context and in many other contexts, when you see a lady your mother's age naked, that's considered like a curse or an omen, especially when she does something like point her private parts at you. So that's exactly what some of these old ladies did when the ministers came. One of the ministers cried. The other government minister looked away in shame and started begging for kind of pleading his case, you know, and they basically failed in their mission to redistrict the land. And this was considered a miraculous victory. The community was very confident at that point that they were going to be able to protect their land for good. And other groups around the country became very, very inspired. That, you know, people without any money, without any, you know, people with disabilities, young children, old ladies could organize themselves and resist some of the most powerful politicians and business people in the country. So after this experience, which we felt was maybe not the end of the story, but certainly successful in many respects, many groups came to us and started asking for the kind of training that we delivered in Amuru, the kind of services. People fighting corruption, people fighting land grabs, people working against unemployment, people working for transparency, and so on. And, you know, we were just a very, very small group of volunteers, essentially, and we didn't have the financial capacity or the time and energy to really meet all these needs. But we thought that we could take some of the influential organizers from each of these movements, burgeoning movements around the country, and kind of convene them into a sort of national umbrella movement. I think we were naive, but also I think we made some bad mistakes at that point. And one of these mistakes is that in this process, we sought out prominent activists, we sought out people of influence, we sought out privileged and educated people that, you know, we thought could go and train communities around the country. And very quickly, this supposed umbrella movement collapsed. This was even at a time in Uganda's political climate. Elections were coming up. You know, people were attuned to the things going on in the country, and we had that fertile soil, I would say, in the political climate to be able to make a very good impact. But we couldn't capitalize on it because we faith in allies and people of privilege rather than the victims of injustice themselves. And this is a picture from one of these trainings. So a few months go by, we have some successes, but really we feel like we're not gaining a lot of ground. And we convene a meeting. My wife Susan went to South Africa and heard from some people who had organized against apartheid that you know, even they who educated did the same thing. They made the same mistake basically. They thought highly of themselves as organizers, but there were certain things that they just couldn't control, and they certainly didn't know how to organize amongst the poor. So it wasn't until they put these poor people in positions of influence, decision-making, and leadership that they started really gaining ground in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So Susan, my wife, thought, you know, this is probably a lesson that we should learn too, and she convened members of this national umbrella movement and asked them, you know, where did we go wrong? And in that particular meeting, we invited the people who were doing good organizing and had made concrete advancements in our struggle. And they told us, you know, we're the poor people. You know, look at who's here. We're the poor people. We're the taxi drivers. We're the small business market people. You know, we're the unemployed. We're the youth. We're the women. We just need to get out of offices. We can't be holding like all these organizing meetings in with bureaucratic institutions. They work too slowly. They don't understand the stresses and the pressure of our struggle, and they kind of co-opt it for their own programs or whatever. They want to make it kind of maybe an NGO program or something like that. From that point, we started. We changed our approach in organizing, and I'll throw a bone here to ICNC. That they helped us organize some trainings amongst poor and vulnerable communities, and since we've kind of changed that toward that strategy of identifying trainees and organizers as those poor and most vulnerable and marginalized people. We've seen better results. You know, in a training that goes on just for a few days, we've seen people go back to their communities and really take action without resources and at their own initiative, shutting down the border with Kenya, occupying government tax offices, collecting thousands of signatures and disseminating information about nonviolent direct action. Even scaling up trainings in high schools. There are so many things that they just hit the ground running, you know, and they've forced companies to do the work they were paid to do and neglecting to do. They've abolished regressive taxes on small farmers. They've made a lot of concrete achievements, even just in the short term. So we see that this strategy is working. I am very curious I know we have many people here on this call that, whether you agree or disagree, I would love to hear your experience if what I'm saying at all resonates with your experience. But let me just be a little bit straightforward about what I think the takeaways from this idea are. First of all, I think in our movements, we can organize the space and the decision-making processes so that those people most affected by the injustices that we want to confront are the people making decisions. And those of us who might have more privilege play a more background role and don't always kind of veto every idea that we don't see as good. Secondly, and this is something in a future webinar with ICNC, you'll hear one of our colleagues from Hungary possibly discuss with his movement with the homeless in Hungary. But it's also important to give that space for victims of injustice to share their messages and their story, to handle media relations, and to articulate things. Here in Uganda, there is this classism in society where any media engagement, they want somebody who speaks, you know, fancy English and this kind of thing. Well, if I'm listening to that, I already, and I'm a farmer, you know, I already don't understand myself as one with this person. So it creates obvious problems in terms of recruitment. And then thirdly, people of influence political leaders, religious leaders, civil society organizations, people who are employed. They should play a supportive background role. I've already mentioned this, but I'll say it again. And this allows for more intersectional organizing. So, but I don't just say that to just throw the buzzword of intersectional out there. I also just think that it's the more effective way to organize, based on my personal experience. So I think at this point we can hear a case study from, I serve on the board of Solidarity Uganda now. Scovia is one of our trainer coordinators. She serves central Uganda, so the capital city and its kind of surrounding areas. And she's part of one of the co-founders of the Women for Uganda movement. And we have a brief video that we can share from her.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. I would also like to let everyone know that in the next several minutes, we will be going on to questions and answers, and David Reinbold, who is our tech guru here at ICNC, will give you some descriptions of how to do that. But we do want you to know that we want to hear your input, and we're going to have a significant part of the last 20 minutes that we'll be getting input and advice and ideas from participants. So let's go ahead and listen to Scovia.
In Uganda, we have our president who has been in power for the last 31 years. And in the constitution, there is a constitutional provision that says one is not supposed to contest beyond a certain age, which we believe he has clocked. But we know that there are intentions by parliamentarians to adjust or remove this clause in this article in the constitution. So there's this. We decided to come up as women in the women's movement. We formulated the women's movement that decided to stop this whole thing of scrapping off that article from the constitution. So we decided to go and pray for parliamentarians to have divine intervention, because we believed that this was a non-violent way of how we could do an action and make the masses aware of what parliamentarians were going to do. So we decided to go to Parliament in this guise of prayer, but also for the public to get to know and stand up and do something about this constitutional change that was about to take place. And in this action, we had about 30 women that were arrested. We decided to dress in white to symbolize peace, but also to symbolize non-violence. We advocate for non-violence. But unfortunately, we were arrested. All the 30 women were arrested. But the good thing about it is that we had organized. We had lawyers on standby. And when we were arrested, a number of other women actually came on board. We had more than 200 women come to the police station, and this was so energizing. Women turned up in big numbers. It was a sign that women can actually change something. They just need a little bit of organizing, and we did it. And this enabled the speaker, who is also a woman. We believe in the nature of being a woman. She heard the cry of the women that day, and when the bill was tabled, it was actually dismissed from Parliament. And we believed we achieved for that time. However, we've had challenges as the women's movement, because at that time, yes, we achieved, but sustaining a movement requires women, requires people that are directly affected by what we are addressing. And at that time we had, and this time we had people, we had women who are working, women who are not really affected by the problem itself and the manifestations of the problem itself. And it's only when somebody directly feels the injustice and the magnitude of the problem that the movement can actually sustain. So one of the challenges we've had is that we've not had people or women or even men who are directly affected by the magnitude of the problem coming on board to see the continuity of the movement. Because once you're affected by the problem, you want to put your strength, you want to put your head there, and you get the thing moving. Unless we organize these people, which takes time, which needs resources, we need to get the people that are directly affected by the problem to be able to sustain the movement. It is the only way we can have a movement sustained, and once the movement is sustained, we shall have to do away with this problem called dictatorship. And all the others will fall in place. Unless we address the challenge of dictatorship in Uganda, the rest of the things shall remain manifestations. We do not want to deal with manifestations, we actually want to deal with the real problem, and the real problem is dictatorship. And the women's movement is strategically organizing to ensure that the social injustices that we are facing in this country end. And the only way they are going to end is by ending dictatorship. So you're welcome to join us.
Great. What an amazing woman. Yeah, I felt lucky to be working with her, I can see.
Yeah.
And having her as a leader of the movement. Go ahead with the rest of your presentation, and then we'll be really excited.
We're still campaigning for affordable and fast internet here in Uganda, as well as internet that stays on. They often, the dictator often puts off social media or prevents us from even using our phones. About half the country experienced a blackout on the mobile network for a day or two just this week. So just a few takeaways from, let's see if I can minimize this. From the Women for Uganda story, the brief story that Scovia shared. The point here is that Women for Uganda had a lot of success at the beginning because they were able to pull in a lot of different constituents. They had lesbians, a number of lesbians in a very homophobic country. They had union members, these ladies who were making the equivalent of maybe $20 or $30 a month. This was not just ladies who work for civil society organizations or something of the kind. They realized that they shared a common interest in seeing an end to dictatorship, and they saw an opportunity in that that clause in Uganda's constitution that prevents anybody from staying in power beyond age 75. And they didn't want the parliament to scrap that away. So, you know, they got arrested when they planned an action, and a lot of them came to me afterward and they said, "Phil, we're really sad that we never got to do the prayer march." And I told them, no. Look, the Speaker of Parliament scrapped the bill. You put even more pressure on them by getting arrested, and you had that solidarity because you had that solidarity because when one of your members got arrested, the rest of you stood up and said, "You have to arrest all of us if you're going to arrest one of us." So there were a lot of initial successes for their debut action. They had organized lawyers to prepare them in case to prepare for any kind of collateral damage in case there were arrests or any kind of like tear gas or beatings of women. But one thing which Scovia didn't draw out a lot in her brief video is that the Women for Uganda movement has had some trouble sustaining momentum and escalating conflict. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that a lot of their meetings are, you know, organized by either employed ladies or ladies that are older. So retaining that regular participation amongst the more oppressed female demographics is quite difficult. I'm sorry. So and then maybe just as a side note, their tactic was relatively low risk. But through that planning, having media ready, having lawyers ready, having people ready to bring meals to the prison and those kind of things, they were able to leverage the state's repression back against the state. And we call that either political jujitsu if you've read Gene Sharp, or backfire is also a synonymous term. Basically, the idea is that when you do an action, prepare for repression so that when it happens, you can expose your opponent and you actually make more gains for your movement because of that. Maybe just a few final comments about me as an individual, because I've re-understood my niche in all of this as an individual person over the past several years that I've lived in Uganda. I've been here since 2009. I did write a book about one experience that I had. You can see the name here if you want to search for it on Amazon. But I had gone to prison at one point, and it caused me to reflect a lot on my particular role as you know, a white foreigner or a white foreigner. And here are a few takeaways that I think for many of you, you might be an academic or generally a person of privilege. I think maybe just a few practical things to share with you. One is that I've stopped advising people on which tactics to use. I don't do a lot of training as much as I used to myself. We have a very knowledgeable and equipped, skilled staff that can do that. But where people really push me for the answer, which tactic can we use to build momentum and gain ground for our struggle, I usually ask them questions and try to point them toward principles rather than suggesting which tactics they should use. Local people and people affected by the issues understand how things work, and they have the full capacity and creativity to select which tactics to use. Second, I'm quite focused on fundraising. I have some connections which some of my neighbors don't in terms of money. Thirdly, I try to connect as much as possible with international allies and movements abroad that share similar values and goals. I might have a bigger grasp on the international kind of terrain because I come from another country, and I've been to other countries and worked with activists elsewhere. So that's something I can contribute to these local struggles. I'm a journalist, and I do a lot of news writing and that kind of thing. And then lastly, I don't manage any kind of programs or micromanage movements or anything like that. Rather, I just serve on the board of Solidarity Uganda and try to provide the contacts and linkages and anything that I can do in order to kind of serve from the background. So my understanding of myself as an activist has really changed. My own role has really changed over the past few years. And I think that's good enough for now, Catherine. And I think we can go to a time for questions. And if anybody else has something to add or share, I think that's appropriate.
Thank you, Phil. I think that your advice, your experience, your wisdom really, for such a young person, has always really amazed me. And your dedication to the cause and kind of your very deep understanding of the bridging role that you're playing, on what you bring to the table, on the value added, talking about the fundraising and international bridging and connections, but also very deeply embedded in the community and the movement, is really fascinating, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. So thanks for that. We've already having some questions come in, and again, it wouldn't necessarily be only questions. We're definitely wanting people, we can see from some of the participants that we have a lot of experienced people out there as well. So anyone that would also like to, you know, ask questions, but also give advice or discussion or answer some of Phil's questions. He raised some issues and some challenges that they're having. We would welcome that as well. The first question that I see coming in, and we've got a number, is I would like to know what communication tools and feedback mechanisms worked well, both for helping the organizers work with their communities, but also as a way to track activity and participation. For example, besides tracking attendance at the trainings, did you track if people talked about or coordinated more after the trainings as a result? What other metrics or ways of measuring help you tell that the trainings are actually working? So go ahead, Phil, and if you'd like to answer the first question.
Sure. Good question. Monitoring and evaluation, that kind of thing, tends to fall to the wayside a lot. We've only been really focusing on it for the past like half a year to a year, that we've tried to get more serious about it, because we've seen that need to fine-tune where we've been ineffective, where we've failed or fallen short. We want to know why. And I mean, of course, there are those indicators, how many people attended the training, that kind of thing. But usually for a training, we aim for 20% of people to actually get serious and get active and, you know, be self-motivated and driven to do something. And so what we try to do is to identify who those individuals may be, and then follow up closely with them. We don't necessarily put all of our time and resources and energy into every trainee and every person. We will like have a phone call to people who are, I would say, maybe like passive allies, like people who don't really follow through as much, but we still see them as valuable. So I wouldn't say that we have a sufficient enough way of like measuring our impact. Simply because there are, you know, any number of things that come up. You know, we're so overworked and tired, and you know, somebody disappears one night, and then you got to launch into emergency mode for the next week and figure out who kidnapped him and where he's being tortured. You know, these are real challenges that we face. You know, somebody's threatened. I've had, you know, threats to our family. My wife was attacked. You know, so some of these kind of things, you know, they're prohibitive in terms of really sitting down and analyzing how well we're doing. We would really love if anybody has tools in monitoring and evaluation. It's actually one of the areas, I think, in this whole civil resistance arena that there aren't a lot of tools for that. But one thing we do try to do is to look at our allies and see how much they've shifted, like on a scale of 1 to 10, right? So if we've identified that we need students in a particular area, we need university students or secondary school students, from month to month, you know, they might move from 5 to 7 in terms of how active they are. So we do try to do that every now and then, but it's really, really, really hard to create that time and deliberate space to do it. And I would say that even though I'm saying that we barely do it, there are so many groups who even do it like far less than us or not at all, just because of the demands, especially in repressive environments.
Thanks, Phil. Next, I'm going to ask one more question, and then it looks like Stellan is there for a question himself, and Stellan will get to you in just a minute. The next question is coming in from Madagascar, and it says, "Hi, Phil and Catherine. Internet is bad, and I'm afraid I'll be cut off if I activate the mic. So let me ask my question here. As we know, there's a lot of internet issues when you're in more rural areas or areas where internet isn't reacting so well. Phil, thanks for your presentation and the tremendous work that you're doing. I'd like to know how many members or activists does your movement count in the whole country, among what populations, and you've talked about some. And then you talked about international allies. In Madagascar, when you work with such allies, local people say that you are tutored, not independent, defending foreign interests, and so on. Don't you have the same problem in Uganda? If so, or if yes, how do you deal with that in order to keep people's trust? Thank you, Kay.
That's a great question. That was from Kay, yeah?
Yep.
Thanks, Kay, for that, and for your struggle in Madagascar. I hope you'll find time to share with more people in this this particular forum. If they reach out to Catherine, I'm sure Catherine is willing to connect them to Kay. Kay has a very strong movement there in Madagascar. She might not say that. She might be more modest about it, but you know, these are really repressive contexts that some of us live in, and even when you're making a little impact, there's a lot to be said of that. And Kay is one of those people who's surely making an impact. So how many members and activists do we have? Well, we don't micromanage movements as an organization, as Solidarity Uganda. We are, we're just there to support movements, give them infrastructure, help them network, give them skills and knowledge that they can use to be more effective in their own struggles. So we don't necessarily count anything as our movement. There are so many movements of thousands of people or of 10 or 20 people in different parts of the country. And sometimes even these small groups of 10 or 20 make a bigger impact than these groups of tens of thousands of people. But directly, the number of people that we have trained has reached in the thousands. We're not yet in the tens of thousands. I don't know the exact figure offhand, and I don't know if we even have that exact figure. But I would say that in general, in comparison to our neighbors in Kenya and Congo and some of our neighbors adjacent to Uganda, we don't have that culture, that history of civil resistance. So we very much are at square one, and a lot of the people that make the most impact are, again, those victims. They may not say, I'm an activist. They may not say, I'm the one who organizes this community or something like that. They might just say, like, look, I'm one of the members of this farming cooperative, of this orange growers cooperative or mango growers cooperative or something, you know? And that might be how they identify themselves. A lot of people say, you know, I'm one of the mothers from this area. So it's one thing that's really hard to measure, but I'll say that spirit of civil resistance has grown a lot in the past 3 to 4 years in Uganda. Things are just getting too bad, and people are just realizing that it's a lower risk it's a higher risk to stay with things as normal and keep the status quo than it is to like act and resist dictatorship and oppression. So that spirit is coming alive slowly by slowly. And then this question of trust, getting trust from the community. Indeed, in many parts of Africa, money is a form of dominion. And if I give you, you know, $50 or the equivalent thereof, I'm perceived as like your owner. And because we're against all of those structures of gerontocracy, patriarchy, and patronage, and all that kind of stuff, we really try to be deliberate about that. And the practical way of doing that is to have our trainees understand where funds come from. Sometimes funds come from Uganda. Actually, quite often they do. But sometimes, and very often, they come from places outside of Uganda and even outside of Africa. And so we really try to explain to them, you know, how much money we got. This is what we spend it on. And then those people who we see are serious and they're very active after trainings and they've been taking action and organizing well. Sometimes we call them back for feedback meetings and explain to them, look, here's the funding is done. What do we do now, right? Have a look at what we achieved already. Where do we need to go from here? So involving them, you know, organizing is about everything. It's not just about going to the streets. It's also about fundraising. It's also about scaling up trainings. It's also about going and doing radio talk shows or whatever. So that trust, I think, is best built when everybody who is serious, I would call them serious people. I don't know if that's the best phrase to use, but if they're involved at every step of the process, you will build that trust.
Thanks, Phil. And I think trust from ICNC's perspective too, both working with grantees and fellows in the field, like Phil and others, and Kay, we're finding trust is one of the key pieces, both with an international partner, but also, you know, the people in the field, part of the movements, trainers, practitioners, that you really can't get around that, and that the unity that we need to build, that trust is so much a part of it. So thank you for mentioning that piece. Stellan, I think you had your hand raised and you've got a similar question, but could you go ahead? If you can ask it in person would be great, otherwise we can read what you've asked us.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good to hear from you.
Right. Hi Phil, thank you very much for sharing your experience here. So I wanted first just to comment on a thing, and then I have a question. So very briefly.
Are you there, Stellan? I can't hear anything.
You don't hear me now?
We can hear you, but Phil may not be able to.
All right. Okay, so maybe you should read up my question instead.
Phil, can you hear him?
I just got my audio back. So maybe
go ahead, Stellan. Let's try it.
Okay, do you hear me now, Phil?
Nope. Not hearing anything.
Okay, so Phil, I'll ask you, can you hear me now? You may or may not be able to hear me as well. Yeah, this is the issue with the internet and connections in the field. It's not always easy. It's a really good example of trying to train or connect. So Phil, we're going to hope to hear from you. But if not, we'll wait and kind of hear whether Phil comes back. I do want to let everyone know that Kay responded to Phil's comment that she really believes he hit on a key point, which was about the price of the status quo. A lot of us who work in this field, you can also call it structural or cultural violence. The fact that the price of the status quo and the reality is actually worse, both in cost to people in lives than actually acting. And I think a lot of times that's when overcoming fear comes in as well, because things are so bad that you're ready to act, to change things, and you lose your sense of fear bonding with other people. But Kay says that's the same thing they're finding in Madagascar. So we really appreciate that, Kay. And I don't know whether, Phil, can you hear us now? I'm hearing something. Okay, I don't know whether anyone else on the group would love to have a little bit of input into the discussion. It would be great to hear from you. I'm looking on the page at a past one of our attendants at a FSI, our Fletcher Summer Institute, Fikri. Fikri, can you, I know you're from Burundi and actually in the UK right now. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question in person, or should we go ahead and read that out for you? Okay, so Fikri's question is, and if Fikri, if you want to come in, go ahead and do it. His point is that he's from the Burundi. He's actually in UK right now for his studies, and threats and direct attacks against activists and CSOs in Burundi are really high. What strategies can be used to continue working with people even from abroad? And again, I'm going to wait for Phil to come back, and I may facilitate some of the conversation as well, unless we get Phil back in. So what I could say from that, Fikri, is we found a lot of really interesting knowledge and skills from people that are in the diaspora or outside of their countries. And we see from Ethiopia recently, there are a number of different African groups. I was working with an Southeast Asian group actually just this weekend in one of their major annual conferences that was held in the United States, where they offered nonviolent training. And I think part of that is has to do with using your influence and your ability to bridge, as Phil mentioned, whether it's fundraising, whether it's getting the message from internally in the country and spreading that message through media when people locally can't get that message out. There's a number of different examples of civilian journalists, like in Burundi, also in Burma and other really repressive areas, where people on the ground were able to use their contacts that are in diaspora or outside of the country and some of their alliances to pass on the media and the information to actually shine a spotlight on what was happening in the country. And also lobbying and advocacy, whether it's sitting in at embassies, whether it's organizing local people and then creating allies from religious groups, from allies within the country where you're based, let's for instance the UK, finding people that also stand for rights and justice, educating them, making them aware of what's happening, and then using them and working with them to access members of parliament, advocacy groups. There's groups like Avaz that create international campaigns that you could organize from abroad that would help lower those risks and help also highlight what's happening in the country. Again, with the hope that it would motivate people, build their morale, not make them feel so isolated, and possibly can create international backfire, which Phil talked about, so that people see the repression, they see what's going on, and it actually builds the movement, builds the support for people internally when they may feel isolated or alone. So that's kind of one piece I can offer. I'm sure Phil has other ideas, but I'm just worried that we've lost him now. Yeah, we're not getting Phil back. So other questions or comments? I see a number of other people, attendees and participants. Would you like to share information or ideas or comments with the other participants in the call?
And just, I'm going to try to take away Phil's webcam. That might help with his bandwidth issue.
Phil, are you there?
I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You're back. Great.
Okay, I've been catching bits and pieces of some of what you're saying, Catherine, but largely I was absent.
Okay, if you'd like to add anything, and then we have a really good comment from Stellan as well that I can read. So Phil, would you like to add anything just to the idea of how kind of working from the outside you might assist with dealing with repression and the cost to really hard struggles in the field? And Fikri is from Burundi, but he's based in UK right now. Okay, we may have lost Phil. He may be coming and going. So Stellan, I'd like to mention his comment. Stellan says, since you do not hear me, Phil, he wanted to add a comment. I agree with your principle of victim-led campaigns and relegate the privileged for support roles. However, it is not enough to decide this, but to make it possible. To my knowledge, one of the key reasons that the MST, the Landless Farmers Workers Movement in Brazil, which is a fairly well-known nonviolent resistance movement, is so strong is that you put a strong emphasis on the formation or education of all their members, literacy, farming techniques, as well as activist training at their own university. Through this strong part of the work, they develop leadership from below. So he says, thanks, Phil, and in solidarity, Stellan. So that's another good example of how you actually make this happen, this idea of supporting and movements being led by those that are the most oppressed and the people that have the most to gain and really, in some ways, the least to lose because of the structural violence that they're dealing with daily. Anyone else, would you like to add information? We just have a few more minutes and we were hoping to get Phil back. Okay, Dr. James Nicholas Shemby, go ahead.
It looks like, could you go ahead and unmute yourself? It's showing that you're have yourself muted. There you go.
Okay. Okay. I've got a question to ask because Philip said that he was also working with the taxi drivers. Now, my question is, what methodology that is using to work with the taxi drivers? It's distributing like trucks to them, and so that in case maybe when they are doing their work, they can also distribute those trucks to passengers and so on, so that the movement may be growing or sensitize people with the same information, whatever. So I want to ask a strategy that is using to talk to those taxi drivers so that can win their trust and so on.
Do you have any experience in your own country? I know that people have worked with different drivers, the boda drivers also, and motorcycle drivers in various countries to pass messages, to do the kinds of things you're talking about. Maybe you have experience in your own country.
So what we do usually, we provide some trucks that we start distributing to drivers because they meet with different people when they're doing their work. So at that moment when they are in that taxi, maybe taking somebody somewhere, they can share something to that person. After that, give the truck to that person, so that in case also the same person can also give the same truck to other person. Maybe they can be given 5 to 10 trucks that when they drop off the vehicle, they can also distribute and so on. So that method also is easier than maybe going on radio sometimes in some military countries. Like in the DRC, whatever, when you just go on radio, before even if you finish your presentation, you'll be arrested right there at the radio station. So I prefer that like in Uganda, Congo, Rwanda, maybe when you use trucks, it's a little bit effective and faster than going on the media, because I've seen a lot of media houses being closed because they have allowed other people to go and speak maybe on behalf of people and so on. So the other thing is that they organize like maybe a concert with those people. Maybe they go with instruments right there, the taxi rank, and there they share 1 or 2 things. Present music. After that, they start now telling them what their aim is, whatever, and you have seen effectiveness into that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I guess you're mentioning a lot of work with communication, spreading messages, texts, spreading through music and other kinds of messages when it might be much more dangerous for people to do that in other ways. And I know that I've also heard about blockades, where actually boda drivers or taxi drivers has actually surrounded parliament buildings, blocked roads. Again, there's safety in numbers of having so many of them, and also they've gone on strikes. And without that mode of transportation, it can actually shut down cities and whole regions of a country. Phil, it looks like you're back with us. I hope so. We're getting toward the end. I don't know whether you've heard some of the discussions. There was a question about taxi drivers and the drivers and how you're working with them.
Okay. Okay, let me answer that. That's about all I know of the discussion, but I think that's just as well, because I'm sure there are many great people that had a lot to say. So we've been working with the taxi drivers for about 2 years now, and they did quite well without us, actually, and I think that's one of the reasons we tried to identify them and really top up on their existing skills and experience. So the taxi drivers comprise a very informal sector of the capital city's economy, and almost everybody uses them. You know, public servants need to get to work, business people need to get to work, people need to go to town, need to go to the market. So they're really, you know, the spine of everything that happens in the capital city, and without taxis, nothing goes on. So they had in the past resisted multiple taxation. They were being charged these petty kind of off-the-record taxes by state agents, and they got tired of it and decided to stop paying those illegal taxes. Well, some of them went to prison because of this, especially the organizers, I would say the leaders in the taxi associations. And when they were in prison, they informed their colleagues to take the taxis off the streets. And they did so for 2 or 3 days. And the topmost police head in the country basically came begging on his knees to the people that were, the taxi drivers that were detained, saying, you know, just get them back on the streets, we'll release you unconditionally, you don't need to pay the tax anymore. So we knew that they understood the pillars of support for their opponent. They understood how to compromise their opponent's source of revenue and present a threat. And we saw their determination in that. So we've been training them ever since. And transportation sector. What I've noticed about these guys is that they're probably the most strategic constituency that we've ever consulted. And you know, just learning some of these basic tools like the spectrum of allies, there are some things that you can view on ICNC's website, like the spectrum of allies and other tools. Learning those kind of things just supplements the existing knowledge that they have. So we learn as much from them, I think, as they learn from us. But in the past year or so, I would say that one tactic the state has used is to buy off different leaders of different routes in Kampala, the capital city of Uganda. So I know that there's this partisan sort of like bribery and division, kind of divide and rule that's happening within their community. But recently they formed a savings cooperative. It has over 200 members within the first month. You know, they have these kind of where people come together around a common interest, you know, making sure that we have enough money to survive, making sure that fuel prices are not astronomical. Right now they're in a serious conflict with an investor who there's basically one piece of land. It's what they call the old taxi park. There's a new taxi park as well, but it's a small area. So this old taxi park is sort of this transportation hub of the entire city. So without it, everything breaks down. And there's a private investor that wants to push them off of their land there and basically build up these plazas and shopping kind of spaces. And of course, all of these investors have their ties very, very close to the first family. So they're discussing about boycotting some of the gas stations that this investor has a stake in financially. They've made copies of the president's letter. They got the president they pressured the president at some public function to say that the land should stay with the old taxi driver. So they copied that letter and disseminated it across their routes. And they're an organized route. You know, every week I work closely with one of their leaders. He's quite well known in that kind of busy part of Kampala, and he says, like, you know, every week the leaders from the routes must call me, explain how the route's going and everything. So they have their own systems and structures already in place, and I think that's very important in building up movements, is like identifying those groups, however formal or informal they. You know, right now in the United States, of course, those could be churches, which are trying to house undocumented or even documented immigrants at risk. So tapping into those existing structures and kind of like pulling them together and helping them see where their interests coincide with the interests of other constituents. So you keep building allies like that.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I think we're about to the end of our time. I'm going to give you a few minutes to wrap up.
The audio connection was okay. not hearing
Yeah,
anything.
no, it's great. Give you a few minutes to wrap up, and I know you've got a whole new kind of community center you're building and a training center, and you guys are really scaling up. So if you want to talk about that and any final points, and then I'll just give a few resources that we have new from ICNC to close out. So go ahead. Any last words you'd like to leave with us? Okay, so Phil may not be there. At least we got to hear a really good description of how he's working with the taxi drivers and how they're pressuring and using a number of different tactics and strategies to really move ahead. What I'd like to end with is just thanking everyone who's been a part of the call today. Thank you for your patience. I think this is a reality with the field that sometimes it is hard for internet and to stay in touch, but it's a key voice, and I think Phil had so many kind of pearls of wisdom and experience that they've had to be able to pass on to you all, and thank you for your comments and input as well. I just do want to mention that ICNC is continuing this Voices from the Field webinar series. We're hoping to confirm one for next week, and we'll be letting you know. And then there'll be a couple over the summer and going into the fall, including the one from Hungary that Phil mentioned, people that are working with people that are being evicted there. And I do want to mention that we are really prioritizing tools, manuals, PowerPoints, training curriculum from the field that's being developed through our ICN small grantees and our Lynn Fellows, Phil being one of those, Kay being another. And those are being uploaded to our site. You can go to our resource library or go to the tab that talks about activists and practitioners. There are a number of new manuals in Spanish, French, Malagasy, Tagalog, and a number of other in English that are ready for use. We'd like for you to look at those. They're open source. There's also one that is a new curriculum for a 3-day workshop on nonviolent resistance related to anti-corruption and good governance fights. So please use our resources, spread our resources. I see that Phil may be back. Phil, would you like to give us a few words to close out? And hopefully you're back online and can hear us now.
Yeah, I can hear you now, Catherine. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining. I'm always humbled and inspired by all the different struggles that people are waging across the world. So please, Catherine, feel free to share my email. I would love to connect with those of you who are willing to share your stories with me. And thank you very much for your resistance, for your solidarity, for your action, for everything that you're doing to further peace and justice in the world.
Thank you, Phil. Stay safe, and we recorded this webinar, so if people would like to let people know to share it, to use it in classrooms and other kinds of things. And thank you so much, Phil. Say hello to all of the Solidarity Uganda team. Give them our love and our support, and again, be safe. And we know that you're scaling up. I mentioned your community center that you're building, and I know you've done amazing work over the last several years in really harsh conditions. So I think it gives others a lot of hope and a lot of ideas about how to do that effectively. So we'll share the information with participants as far as how to get in touch with Phil, and look forward to working with you in the future and with all the rest of the participants. Thank you for being included today. And thank you, David, for the technology and for supporting us for our webinars.